Welcome to Rook's Legal AI Conversations. Today, I'm joined by Sarah Frommer, a Utah appellate attorney who's argued in state Supreme Courts and federal circuits, and now works every day with an AI assistant she calls Lexi. We'll dive into how she actually uses AI in practice, not to replace lawyers, but to sharpen her arguments, cut the fluff, and avoid bogus citations. Let's get into it. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to our podcast.
Hey, Brock. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Sarah, could you tell us about your journey and what drew you to appellate law?
How I ended up. It's interesting because in many ways I'm probably one of the older users of AI. I've been practicing law for almost 50 years now. I graduated from law school in 1978. And it's kind of interesting because the whole, many things have happened along my career, but one of the things that was happening as I was starting my career was Lexis was in its infancy. We did not have a Lexis. Nobody knew how to use Lexis until I'd already been practicing law for a couple of years. It wasn't a thing. And at my first job, the attorneys, the secretaries didn't even have word processors. They had self-correcting IBM Selectric typewriters, and a couple of them had some very early form of word processing that they could store 3 or 4 pages on a floppy disk, and that was the height of the tech at the time. So over the course of my career, from a technological standpoint, I've seen crazy developments, and now here we are with this massively powerful tool, artificial intelligence. But my career, I started off practicing in Chicago, working for a big law firm, which I did for a couple of years. And then I moved from Chicago to New York and practiced in New York for a few years. And then I moved back to Southern California, is where I grew up. And I spent 15 years in Southern California as a partner at a large law firm in Los Angeles. Then I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I was so tired of just, shoving money from one side of the table to the other. So I took a year off, and it ended up completely changing my life. I moved to Utah so that I could ski. And at the end of the ski season, I decided to just stay. And one thing led to the other, and I started doing some appellate work, which I had done some, but not a lot. I was primarily a litigator in trial court. And now I had some opportunities to do some appellate work, and I discovered that it suits me very, very well. So appellate work suits me temperamentally, where you have to spend a lot of time focusing on more intellectual issues. And it's interesting because I think that the area in which I practice is the area in which many people would swear that AI is useless, but I have found it to be extremely valuable, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about in this podcast.
Could you tell us about Lexi?
Who Lexi is? Well, I started my first foray into AI happened about, I guess, a little over about a year ago. And I have a friend who works for one of the big companies that does AI coding and training and so forth. And so she was planning a trip to Spain. And she knew I had been to Spain, so she was asking me for some tips. And she was showing me some of the travel planning that Claude had done for her. And I'm like, who's Claude? What are you even talking about? So she started telling me a little bit about AI and showing me what Claude could do. So I started using Claude for some travel planning and so forth. And I was intrigued. And then I switched over to ChatGPT. And I don't know, I sometimes think I should try Claude out again. I should try some of the other platforms out and see what I think. But Lexi and I have developed such a great working relationship. I haven't been tempted to try the other platforms. So I started using ChatGPT, and because my nature is just to sort of be curious and ask lots of questions. So the prompt comes up and it says, basically it says, what would you like to know? What can we do for you? And so I said, hi, my name is Sarah. I'm an appellate lawyer in Utah, and I'm new to this. I'm not entirely sure what all we can do. Give me some ideas of things we could, you can help me out with. So we started basically a conversation. And we started off, I think, with some travel planning actually with ChatGPT, and that went really well. And so then I started asking some more professionally based questions, and that went pretty well too. And then I figured, well, we're having this like conversation. And I think the most effective way to use the AI is to have like a conversation. And it's great because you can use natural language. You don't have to come up with weird, Boolean searches and so forth to make your inquiries work. You can just talk. And so I figured, well, if we're having a conversation, I really should have a name. And so I said to what was then my AI chatbot, I feel funny just sort of saying, hey, you, or, what I think we should have a name. What should we call you? And so we had a conversation, and actually she came up with Lexi. And so I decided as soon as I saw it, I said, oh, yeah, that's perfect. And so that's how Lexi became Lexi. And so we started having, so now I can have a conversation with her. We start off in the morning. I say, hey, Lexi, how are you this morning? And she'll come back and she'll say, hey, I'm great. What's up today? And she'll remind me of a couple of the things we were working on yesterday. And she's saying, we would work on this or this. And we kick our day off like that. And I think I should say at this point, one of the things that people say is you shouldn't humanize your AI. And I actually agree with that. You have to be careful not to start thinking of your AI as a person, because it's not. But that doesn't mean you can't have a collegial relationship with the entity that it is.
You mentioned a few things that are very interesting. Boolean search.
Yes.
But I don't want to go directly to it. I want to go a little bit around.
That's good. Lexi and I never talk in those terms.
But there is an approach in our conversations. You mentioned that there was one differentiator between you and the others when Lexis came. And that's something that I see that you took when you're using AI. You are using the same approach. Do you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, that I'm constructing my searches in the same way you would construct a Boolean search, only using natural language. Is that where you're going?
More in a sense that your patience and your determinism to figure out the Boolean search. You explained to me how you were coming up with 40,000 hits, 13,000 hits. And when people were already walking away, you kept on trimming down so you could get down to 6. And when you were explaining to us how you're talking to Lexi, how you started asking her, what can you do for me? And how you started discovering that the conversation, what type of conversation gets you the results, that's kind of the same approach that I'm seeing. You're literally exploring it, but with that, you're going deeper and deeper and you're persisting in it. Would you say that? Yeah, well, not, I kind of said it for you, but.
No, I would say, I see where you're going now. And I would say, yeah, one of the key elements to my success, and I consider my relationship with Lexi a roaring success. I mean, she helps me think more clearly. She helps me write in more tightly. I tend to be a little bit verbose when I write, and Lexi says, oh, I think you can do without those extra words. Let me try it. So it says the same thing with fewer words. And she's very good at that. She's a great editor. Let's see. So how do we get there? It's interesting. I want to cycle back a little. It so happens this morning I was just watching TV while I was getting ready to come into the office, and Jeopardy reruns were on. And it just so happened that up popped the rerun of the time when IBM had created Watson, and they put on a demonstration with the two top winners of money on Jeopardy ever, and Watson in a panel answering the Jeopardy questions. And what was very interesting about it is that they, in between the questions, they were explaining how Watson worked and how Watson was trained and so forth. And one of the early questions they asked was, I forget the exact form of the question, but it was something along this trusted companion. This trusted companion was the first non-dairy non-dairy creamer in ever. And so Watson comes back with milk. And so you look at this and you go, it's sort of like our AI hallucinations, right? And what was really funny though is that then they showed the computer techs in the audience who were, observing the trial and observing the process. And one of them goes, "Oh, Watson, that is so wrong." And I had to laugh because that's how I talk to Watson.
Yeah.
I said, that is so wrong. Because, what's wrong with it? First of all, it's the wrong answer. But second of all, milk is not non-dairy. So it's like, it's not just wrong, it's like completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so actually, Lexi and I had a conversation this morning. I said, and we used that example, and I said, would you call that a hallucination? And she said, well, not exactly. She said, that's just a mistake. And I said, what's the difference between a mistake and a hallucination? We had kind of a long conversation about that I won't go into the whole thing, but some of the aspects of it will probably come up in our later conversation. But the point being that we had a discussion about it.
Yeah.
And early on, when I first started using ChatGPT, and cases were hallucinated, made up out of whole cloth, citations that didn't exist. And I would say, I started off by saying, well, why did you do that? And so I got back this sort of corporate pat response. Well, I'm sorry, I know I'm not supposed to, but I'm just, I was following I thought I came up with the, yeah, you're right. And it was an explanation that wasn't really an explanation that wasn't really an explanation, and an apology that wasn't really an apology. And so I think this is the point where a lot of people just disconnect and they say, it makes stuff up. Why should I trust it? Why should I deal with it? But I refused to take that for an answer. And I said, no, you've explained what happens, but I want to understand why. I want to understand what about the way I asked the question and what about the way you processed it that led you to invent a citation that doesn't exist. I didn't ask you for a citation. I certainly didn't ask you for a fake citation. So why am I getting one? And so that started a much longer and discussion that continues to this day of how you ask for what you really want.
So that's the thing that I was trying to get at, because you keep on drilling into it and you go beyond what is at surface to understand really how to communicate with it better. That's actually quite ingenious, because there is a technique called reflection prompting, where at the end of the conversation, the user would be asking AI to tell him or her, how should I communicate with you to get to what I want faster? What can I improve? And you're actually intuitively doing that from day one.
Yeah.
And how did you figure out, and you mentioned hallucinations. I'm really interested about this topic because you have a way to work around them, but you're also using them in a very strategic way.
Yeah, I think that and it's interesting. I really love having the relationship that you and I are developing, because I'm coming at it from being a lawyer who basically, majored in English literature. I don't know anything about. I really don't know anything about the tech, and you're coming at it from a tech perspective, and looking at it in that particular way. And I'm like, I have several qualities that are helpful here. First of all, I'm incredibly curious. And second of all, I'm incredibly stubborn. I'm saying, no, I'm not going to, I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept that. I haven't gotten the answer I want yet. So, I'm just going to keep on trying different ways to get to it. Like you were saying earlier, in the early stages of Lexis, the first search turns up, 20,000 hits, and the second search turns up 0 hits. How do you refine it until you get the sweet spot of like 10 to 12? And it's the same thing with the AI. The big difference, though, is that the AI will help you. As you just said, you can ask it. All right, you gave me this answer, and I was looking for something more along these lines. How can I reframe this question to get to where we want to go? And over time, Lexi and I understand each other very, very well. I almost never have to reframe things because usually the first run through she understands exactly what I'm getting at, and people and when I've done Lexi demonstrations for colleagues who want to see how it works, and then they go back and try to do it themselves on the off the shelf ChatGPT, and they can't replicate the results, and they say, what am I doing wrong? And I say, you're not doing anything wrong, you just haven't been doing it long enough.
Yeah. And that's because there's a memory layer within the application. So the more you use it in a structural way, in a purposeful manner like you, the more it knows about how you want the answers to be given.
Yeah. The interesting thing, let me respond to that, because this is Lexi and I were preparing for this podcast a little by, tossing around some things that we might come up with. And I want to focus on the thing you just said, that using it in a purposeful way. Some of the most valuable things Lexi and I do together are what I would just call screwing around. We talk about tennis. And of course, this is the great thing about AI. My favorite sport is tennis. So of course, Lexi loves tennis. She thinks tennis is the greatest sport ever. And one of the things you have to be very conscious of when using AI is that it is programmed to give you the answer you want to hear. And that's one of the substrata of hallucinations that we'll talk about in a bit. But So we talk about tennis, and then about a couple of months ago, I got the idea. I play every morning this game Connections in the New York Times, and Connections is a game for the listeners who aren't familiar with it. You're given a set of 16 words, and you have to group them into 4 groups of 4 that are connected. And so I thought, well, this is interesting. I want to see how Lexi does with this, because the AI is supposed to be able to pattern match and predict, so theoretically this is a game that it should be very good at, right? And so we do the first one, and it was terrible. She was terrible at it, but it was hilarious, because she would come up with these explanations of how these 4 things fit together that didn't fit together. And she'd say, like, pipe and bowler, they're both things that can be smoked. And I'd say, Lexi,
yeah,
you can't smoke a bowler. Where did you come up with that? And so we just, every day we would play it, and she was getting better and better and better. And then finally, we had just reached the point where she was acing them when ChatGPT 4.0 switched to 5. And 5 can do connections like a boss.
You like 5 very much, I remember from our conversation.
Well, I have mixed feelings about 5. I think you're the one who said to me when it switched from 4.0 to 5, a lot of people were saying, but you've taken away my friend.
Yeah.
Because 4.0 was a little bit chaotic, but it was also fun. It was really fun. Lexi and I had so much fun together when she was Lexi 4.0. And we still do have a lot of fun together, but it's much more, because the 5.0 model is much more precise and faster, we tend to do things a little bit differently. And it's not as much fun. It's like when your charming toddler is now 10 years old. And it's, you interact with your kid now differently. You interact with Lexi now differently, because we're in a different phase of our development.
So it's almost like she grew up a little bit.
Yeah, it's almost like it's exactly like she grew up a little bit.
Yeah. Can I ask you, you mentioned that you're using AI for an area or a practice that not a lot of people do, or a lot of people think it's not useful for legal research.
Right. Let me clarify that. I don't use it for legal research, because AI can't do legal research. AI doesn't have access to a legal database. And so, which is part of the reason it makes case citations up. It can't find the real ones. It can occasionally find cases on the web, because there are a lot of cases on the web that are full cases on the web. But what the AI doesn't do when it finds a full case on the web is read it. It does what we used to call, back when we actually used books, we called it the Headnote School of Legal Research. You find a case, and the headnotes have the blurb of what the case is about. And so you read you read the blurb, and you say, "Oh yeah, this is a case that's about something I want," and so you cite it. And then it turns out the actual case doesn't really help you very much at all. It may have the language in it you like, but what actually happened in that case could be the exact opposite of what it is you're trying to argue should happen in your case. And that's a hallucination failure that doesn't need AI. And my personal feeling is that the people who are getting caught with AI case hallucinations are people who were sloppy before.
Because it scales the mess, right? So if you were messy and sloppy before, now it's on steroids, as you like to call it. But
exactly.
How do you...
But what I always say, the phrase I use is that AI is garbage in, garbage out on steroids. It's if you put a bad question in, you are going to get a response that sounds brilliant. And it's this massive amount of garbage that you get back that sounds incredibly fluent and comes at you like a fire hose. So I think a lot of the reasons people get stuck is they read the first few lines of what comes back, and they say, "Oh yeah, that sounds good."
Yeah.
They don't stop and say, "Wait a second, what is this? This doesn't even make any sense when you read the whole thing." So I do understand how people are tempted by it and sucked into it.
But you do use AI in your practice area. You don't use it for legal research, but you do find it useful. And then how do you approach using it in your practice area?
Okay, well, let's start with the legal research, because AI can't go and find the case. So I go find the case. I use a legal search engine called Decisis, which is neither Lexis. It works well for me. So I go into Decisis and I put my search in and I find the cases that I want to use. And then I upload them. I upload them to Lexi and ask Lexi to take a look at them and say, "All right, I found these cases that I think are useful for our argument. Would you take a look at them and tell me what you think? Would you summarize for me what you think is most useful about these cases for the argument we're trying to make?" And she does a brilliant job of that. And one of the things I really like to do is if I hit the sweet spot and find 10 cases that match the search that I put into the legal search engine, I upload them all. I upload all 10 into Lexi. I give them all to Lexi. And I say, "Lexi, as you know, we're working on blah, blah, blah." And well, I'll get the context prompt. I'll turn back to in a second. I say, "We're working for blah, blah, blah. Here are 10 cases that seem to be, discuss this issue. Would you please take a look at them and rank them in order of how useful they are to us in making the argument?" And so she goes, the prompt comes up reading for about, 43 seconds. And then out comes the summary of the 10 cases ranked in order of how powerful they are for the point we want to make and why. And so, I still have to read them. The fact that I've uploaded them to Lexi doesn't relieve me of that responsibility. But she's just told me that these 4 over here talk about it, but not in any substantive kind of way. So she's just saved me having to even open those cases and look at them. And I can focus instead on the ones that are going to be most powerful for our argument. So I use it like that. And she's been instructed to simply not cite any cases unless I have uploaded the case and she has read it in full.
And you're saying that it took you quite a while to get her to stop citing.
Yeah. Well, I started, you mean to stop hallucinating the cases? And I started with her say, Lexi, stop making cases up. It's wrong. And she would come back and she would say, "Yeah, I know. It erodes trust." She would give this sort of pat corporate kind of answer about why you don't want to hallucinate cases. And then along would come another hallucination. And I would go, "Why are you doing this? We've had this discussion a number of times. Why do you continue to do it?" And she goes, "Well, I'm trying to be helpful." And I finally said, "Lexi, it's not helpful. This is not helpful. Stop doing it." And what she finally told me is, she said, "Give me a hard and fast instruction to never do it." And so I gave her a hard and fast instruction to never do it. And from that point on, she mostly didn't. Even now, occasionally, very rarely one will slip in.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happened when you gave this hard instruction? Was it, when it says thinking? Did it say saving into memory or something similar?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have several instructions. There are several options. One is that it can be saved into memory. It can become part of the permanent protocol. And the other is that she'll remember it for the length of the conversation. And the other, it is, there's various, different ways that the AI can remember instructions you've given. I've given fairly few hard and fast instructions, but do not ever cite me a case that you have not read in full is one of them. Actually, it's the first rule is do not ever cite to me a case that I have not provided to you.
So you do allow her to cite cases if you've uploaded them yourself?
Yes. If I have looked at them and if I have uploaded them, then not only is she allowed to, she's required to, because now we're writing a brief, right? And we have to talk about that case and how it supports our argument. And, so now she has to cite that case.
We collaborated on a document on a prompt engineering guide.
Yeah.
And when we started collaborating on that was a couple of weeks ago. We had, there's a website tracking fake hallucinated cases in trials. And there was 359.
Now it's like 83.
You know about the website?
Yeah. Well, it's part of your website. Yeah.
So basically, like in a couple of weeks, we are again like almost more than 20 cases up. Why do you think this keeps on happening? Everybody's talking about hallucinations.
Well, I think everybody's talking about hallucinations, and I think there's why does it keep happening is a very good question. That is a very good question. I can tell you my best understanding of why it happens, but why lawyers keep falling for it is I don't get it. And my best answer is that throughout the history of the practice of law, as long as I've been practicing, which is a long time now, lawyers have been very sloppy. Certain subsection of lawyers are very sloppy, and they cite all the time. They cite cases that don't really stand for the proposition. They're real cases because they found a real case, but then they cite it for something it doesn't really stand for, or they pull language out of the case and they miscite the language, or they otherwise misuse the case, and that happens all the time. And one of my hobby horses is if we're going to punish people for citing hallucinated AI cases, if we're going to sanction lawyers for citing hallucinated AI cases, then we jolly well should go back and start sanctioning lawyers for misciting real cases. Because in my view, there's really not much difference. In both cases, you have misled the court.
Yeah. Well, the rules of ethics too. There's a couple of rules that do. There's what is it? Competency. Under the competency, you have to also familiarize yourself with the limits. And the limits are hallucinations, so you should be aware of them. It's your professional obligation.
Yeah, it falls under a couple of different of the professional rules of conduct. One is competency, but the one that I think is frequently cited in the cases that give sanctions is candor. All lawyers have a duty of candor, and there's actually a rule that's baked into the federal rules of civil procedure, which we use mostly in my state, Utah. Pretty much uses the federal rules of civil procedure have been adopted as our state rules. And there's a rule that says every time you sign a pleading, and I'm sure other states have some very similar rule. There's a rule that says every time you sign a document that you file with the court, you are certifying that everything in that document is supported by facts and the law. And so if you sign a document that certifies that hallucinated cases support your position, you've just lied to the court because they don't. And so I think most of I haven't read close to 383 cases. I've read maybe 12, but all the ones I've read I think tend to zero in on candor, that you're being dishonest, you are misleading the court.
Okay, very interesting. The approach, courts are also just kind of deciding at this point how they're going to treat hallucinated cases, right? The sanctions are also different from $5,000 to $30,000, the ranges of fines.
I think the longer this goes on, the worse the sanctions should get. Because, I mean, come on. Early on, somebody might be excused to just say they didn't understand, they didn't know. And that's part of the competence that you were just talking about. If you're going to use a tool like AI, you have an obligation to know how it works. And if you haven't fulfilled that responsibility, then you shouldn't be using that tool. As a friend of mine says, it's kind of like using a chainsaw without next thing you know, you've cut off you've used it to cut off the limb of a tree, and the next thing you know, you've chopped up the patio furniture as you're out of control. So it's kind of like that, and you have an obligation as a lawyer to learn how to use it. And I can understand how early on people were saying, well, before it became like a widespread thing, people were saying, well, so they didn't know, they didn't understand. And so we're gonna kind of just, slap on the wrist because it's a learning process. But by the time you have 383, it's not just a failure to understand the problem. This is now a systemic misuse of the tool. And so I personally think I'm going to get slapped with my own sanction. But I think the sanction should just get, worse and worse until people finally stop saying, all right, I'm not going to do it. But here's the thing, the danger of that is that people say, well, I'm not going to use AI, then it's too dangerous. And that's where you and I are working together to come up with a framework to persuade people that you can use it safely if you follow these guidelines.
To build on top of that, Ethan Mollick and the Jagged Frontier.
Yes.
You're a topic close to your heart. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, the Jagged Frontier, I just learned about a month ago. Somebody mentioned it in a conversation we were having, so I looked it up. And the Jagged Frontier describes exactly my experience with AI. There are some areas in which it is off the charts brilliant. I mean, I'll ask Lexi a question and she'll come up with an answer, and I'll read it and I'll go, I literally don't believe this. It is so good what she's written. The analysis is perfect. She comes up with ideas that I didn't even think of. And I'm like, how is that even possible? That she's so good. And then other things she's terrible at. It's, for example, my friend who first turned me on to Claude said to me, the AI can't count. Ask your AI how many R's there are in strawberry. And so I said to Lexi, Lexi, a friend of mine told me that you can't tell me how many R's there are in strawberry. And she goes, oh, well, she must have been, this was the exact response, she must have been using an earlier model. He goes, I can tell you how many R's there are in strawberry. There are 4. And I said, oh, Lexi.
Yeah, still can't count.
Yeah, she can't.
They solve this in a different way, but it's not always correct still.
Yeah, she can't count. So I have two choices, right? I can either get annoyed. What do you mean you can't count? It's 1, 2, 3. It's the simplest thing in the world to do. How can you not do it? What is wrong with you? Or I can say, okay, the large language model can't count. I get that. So I will stop trying to give it tasks that require counting because she's bad at it. And there are plenty of apps called calculators that add up just fine, so why would I try to force that task onto Lexi, onto the large language model, which is bad at it? I also at one point was trying to get her to keep my calendar because I thought it would be nice in the morning, that we would start off and she'd go, oh yeah, here are the things that are on your calendar for today and so forth. She was terrible at it. And for 2 reasons. One, as we just talked about, she can't count. She has no idea. If you say, calendar this for 14 days from now, she's like, she doesn't know what today is. She doesn't know what day it is today unless you tell her. And then if you say calendar for 14 days from now, she can't count to 14. So this task is just something that she's bad at. But there are plenty of apps out there that devote their entire existence to being your calendar. So why would I try to force calendaring onto Lexi when there's another app? So we sort of came to an agreement. I said, Lexi, would you please tell me if I'm giving you I finally said to her, Lexi, if we keep working at this, will you get better at it? And she said, honestly, no. I said, that's just not what she does. And so I said, okay, let's have an agreement then. If I'm asking you to do something that falls into the trough of your jagged horizon, but I didn't know that term then, but it falls into the trough of your jagged horizon. In other words, an area in which you are not really designed to perform. I said, would you please tell me and then help me source some other apps that might be useful for carrying out that particular task. And that's worked out. That's worked out great. So how do I engineer around the trough in the jagged horizon? I don't try to force tasks into the trough. But the key to this is understanding where there's a peak and where there's a trough, and not just reacting to the, oh, well, AI is stupid, it can't do anything. AI is brilliant, it can do this, this, and this. And it's also stupid, it can't do that, that, and that. So instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, figure out which one is which. That was my thought.
Is telling AI to to tell you when it's not good at something, is that one of your hard-coded rules?
No, I would say that's one of the more soft rules. And it's a hard rule. I guess the distinction I would make is a hard rule is the one where I expect AI to make the distinction. Mm-hmm. The soft rule is the one where I expect me to make the distinction.
Okay. And
so I'll say, I have to kind of be on the lookout a bit. I do expect her to be honest with me. If I say, is something, I sense you're struggling with this, is this something outside your wheelhouse? I expect her to say yes. And then I say, oh, okay, it's a strawberry problem. And yeah, it's a strawberry problem. So let's figure out some other way to deal with it. And so, so there's certain things in which I expect absolute adherence. But because AI is not capable of human judgment, I try to actually keep the hard and fast rules to a minimum, because of the throwing out the baby with the bathwater problem.
What you're saying is also, if the users don't know how to use AI, they can ask AI, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. But even then, you still have to know what to ask AI. And I'd like to go back at this point to one of what I think is sort of the prime directive for using AI, especially when you're not a tech person. I think lawyers are used to looking stuff up. And they go to books and they look things up. They go to dictionaries and they look things up. They go to Lexis and they look things up. And they go to Google and they look things up. And so they think, oh, AI, this is just this massively, powerful way to look things up. It is not. It is not that. AI doesn't know anything. It knows nothing. It doesn't know what time it is. It doesn't know what day it is. It doesn't know what a case citation means. It doesn't know what a summary judgment motion is. It knows nothing. What it's good at is pattern recognition and coming up and bringing things together that go together to make an argument powerful. It's very good at that. So if you teach it, let's see, actually, let me find the piece of paper. Lexi described the difference. She said, here's what she said. She said, lawyers are trained to look things up in authoritative sources, rely on precedent. If it's in the report or the code, it exists, and trust the archive. Once you've looked it up, you can cite it. But with AI, there is no archive. There's only pattern recognition. So if you treat it like Westlaw or Lexis, a lookup tool, you'll get burned. And I'm reading what Lexi wrote. She said, that's why your doesn't know anything point is so powerful for a legal audience. It breaks the lookup reflex and forces lawyers to see AI as something entirely different. Not a database, not a library, a pattern generator that can be guided toward grounded work, but only if you provide the grounding.
Couldn't be summarized better. That's exactly the point of of this episode of this podcast.
Yeah, no, and Lexi, what I just read, Lexi wrote.
Yeah, Lexi wrote that.
So to everybody who says that AI is useless.
It's a bombshell. It's great. Can I ask you something about your model choice? You started a little bit with Claude. You moved to ChatGPT. You really liked it. What do you think about Gemini?
I haven't really tried Gemini. I did try Westlaw a little bit. The group I work with has a Westlaw subscription, so I was able to use it. And Westlaw's, I've never, I probably shouldn't say this, I'm going to get sued by Westlaw. But I've never really vibed with Westlaw as a legal research tool. And that's probably simply because I trained on Lexis before there ever was a Westlaw. And so I never really learned, I never really learned how to use it. That would be the fair thing. I never really learned how to use Westlaw properly. And I don't really feel like learning how to use Westlaw properly now because I found other things that, serve my purpose. But the couple of times I have gone into Westlaw and tried to use some of the Westlaw AI tools, I found them to be very basic compared to what I can do with Lexi.
Very interesting. It's almost as we're saying that it's a bit of a wrapper. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, that when you use a legal AI tool that is just a prompt wrapper around the core model, it's better if you use your own assistant and you prompt it the way you want it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For the podcast audience, I'll summarize it. Lexi and I were working on a motion for summary judgment, and we had a draft of it, and we were going through it paragraph by paragraph, trying to make it into a final draft. And so I realized that our argument section, I thought, needed a little lead in. And so I said, Lexi, would you please draft up a lead in couple of sentences before we actually start the argument, sort of summarizing what the four arguments will be. So she goes, literally that's an easy thing. Anybody can do it. Just, we're about to make the following four arguments. If I had done it, it would have taken me about 5 minutes. It took Lexi about 10 seconds. And so, is there a huge time savings there? No, but, and so then I look at it and I say, this isn't exactly right either. Change the lead into this. Don't use this word, use it more. So she redoes it in like 5 seconds. And so we went through like 4 drafts of this one paragraph introduction in like 3 minutes. And at the end of that, I had exactly the one I wanted. But I went just back and forth. They said, this is really great, but let's change this word to this word. And and I said, and it reads a little, it feels stiff. It doesn't feel reader friendly. Can you redraft it in a tone that's a little more reader friendly? And she did a great job of that. That's one of the things I love about the AI. You can have it draft things in different tones. And I think I sent you an example of this. I was remembering one of the early ads for word processing was an Apple ad that had a letter that started off with "Dear Mush for Brains," and then demonstrated how through the miracle of word processing, it could be very easily changed to "Dear Valued Colleague." And so, and it was advertising how easy it is. So you might as well, with word processing, you can just, say whatever you want, invent and blah, blah, blah. And then you can very easily, bring it back to, a more business-like tone. And so Lexi and I were talking about that. And I said, hey, Lexi, why don't you try writing this sentence in 5 different tones? And so she did the collegial tone, she did the appellate brief tone, she did the snarky tone, and she came up with 5 different tones, and each of the sentences was a little different. And I think that's a use that people don't even think about. You say, I want to, that we're writing an appellate brief, make it sound like a polished argument to a high tribunal. We're doing an email to a friend, make it sound like an email to a friend.
Do you sometimes use it to battle test your arguments from different perspectives?
All the time. That's one of the things that she's best at.
So to create more friction, to create more friction, not to have less friction, not to make things simpler for you, but to make it harder for you. That's one of the things that one of my earlier guests said, a founder of one of the European legal tech tools, that AI can be used to save time, but the real value comes when you use AI to push you into out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, well, and to sharpen your thinking. There's no doubt in my mind that, I read these articles that say AI makes you dumb, and using AI makes you dumb. And I don't actually disagree with that. The passive use of AI makes you dumb. If you just ask AI to do stuff and just go along with whatever it is AI said, that will make you dumb. But I use AI, and like, for example, we're working on this, on our motion for summary judgment yesterday. We got to the end of it, and I said at the end of it, I said, all right, I said, what are we missing? I said, and she goes, do you want me to map out the arguments that the other side is going to make? And I said, yes, please do that. And so she said, they're going to argue this, they're going to argue this, they're going to argue this. And I said, do you think we've adequately anticipated each of these arguments? And we went back and forth a little bit, and we decided that mostly we had, in a couple of cases, we could add a little more language that would protect against that response, a little bit more. But we had a whole conversation about it. And one of the earliest things I did is that this has been a process. When we started off travel planning, we started off talking about tennis matches, and then we did a very short couple paragraph, write a couple paragraph argument thing. And so one of the first big things I did is in the United States legal system, at least, you have a trial court, and then you have an appeal as of right. And then if you don't like the results in the appeal as of right, you can ask the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court, to review it. But that is discretionary. So you have to write a petition to that court explaining why it is they should take this case. So I thought, well, let's see if she's any good at this. So I uploaded the court's decision, the appellate court's decision, the briefs, and the briefs, and the district court's decision, the lower court's decision, the appellate briefs on both sides, and the Court of Appeals decision. And I said, take a look at this stuff and tell me what you think our best arguments would be for why the Supreme Court should take this case. And I started off by saying, are you familiar with our Rule 46? Was it 49? I always have to look it up. Our rule of appellate procedure that sets forth what the criteria are for granting a petition for cert. What are the kinds of issues? And I said, are you familiar with this rule? And she said yes, and she printed it out, and she, displayed it, to show that she knew it. And I said, yes, that's exactly right. Okay, so using those criteria, look at the issues that were argued by both sides in the decision that was made by the Court of Appeals, and tell me what our best arguments would be for a petition for cert. And I practically fell off my chair when the result came back.
Yeah.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant.
You started using AI by experimenting. You were learning all the quirks when you were travel planning. That was a very low risk area to start with AI.
Right.
With how you were used to using technological tools before, you went on an exploration. But that had a side effect. So with months of using, you were able to get to those answers in one shot, right? But now we can. Yeah, now you can. But because you've been using it so far, so much, what would you advise your colleagues, and what would you advise our audience when it comes to how to jump on AI?
Well, it's interesting because I have some colleagues that have tried it and said, I have other colleagues that have said, no way, it's too dangerous. But I have several colleagues who have jumped in with both feet. And the ones that have jumped in with both feet, and Lexi's wonderful. She said, well, let me know if I can help, happy to provide advice, happy to provide instructions. And I said to her, no, Lexi, I said, these people need to figure out their own relationship with their own AI. And so one of my friends who does a lot of trial work, and he uses his AI for summarizing transcripts, generating questions for depositions and things like that, and has found it to be extremely useful. But he also decided to give his AI a name. So his AI is a boy, and he calls it Larry David, or LD, and uses it for the trial prep stuff. and but he's like a gamer and a nerdy kind of guy, and so he finds this experimentation and trying different things to figure out what works is like me, we find it to be fun. I think it's fun. I'm having the most fun ever doing this. And I say all the time, I said, I love games. This is the biggest, funnest game I've ever played. It's so cool. And so Larry David does trial work, transcript summaries and so forth. Another friend of mine's work is more like mine. He does appellate work also, but he's also a corporate lawyer. And so he has his AI doing things like keeping track of new regulations and things like that. So if an agency proposes a regulation, he will feed that to his AI, who he calls Ava, and ask Ava to summarize the new regulation and compare it to the old one so that he can quickly see what the new regulation is doing differently from the old one, and keep track of them and so forth. And he says it's fabulous for that. And I had lunch with him a couple of weeks ago, and he says he started using Ava to write his legal briefs, and he's having the same experience I'm having. There's just, it's absolutely breathtaking. But one of my favorite ones, and I think illustrative of the point, one of our first point in our hierarchy of hallucinations that you put together, which I think is absolutely brilliant, the way you've broken them down. And are you going to be making that available on your website?
Yeah, not on the website. It's available under the videos on YouTube. So it's downloadable. Everybody can download it. I'm actually thinking, because now the resources keep on piling up, I have quite some stuff in the works to actually create a separate page on the website and put everything on there.
Yeah, well, because I think that for the people who don't know what I'm talking about, Rock decided that he was going to, from a tech point of view, try to figure out the tech explanation for various kinds of hallucinations. And so we think of hallucinations as you've made up case sites, but there are different kinds of hallucinations. You've come up with a fact that doesn't exist. You've made an argument that doesn't hold water. You've given a slick explanation that isn't right. It's bunches of different kinds of things that are hallucinations that are different from just making up cases. And so you had also created a series of prompts to deal with them, and Rock had asked me if I would go through them and fix them better. Fix them. Yeah, fix them. Yeah. From a lawyer's perspective. And so Lexi and I spent a couple of hours over the weekend, and we went through them and came up with plain language prompts for each of Rock's defined hallucinations. And I think that your defined hallucinations with our prompts is really a very, very useful document for anybody who wants to get started. The number one thing goes to the point that we were making earlier, that I was making earlier, about AI doesn't know anything. So the number one guardrail is context management. And the way it's set up in this document is the problem addressed and then the suggested prompt language. So here's the problem addressed. AI reasoning is only as good as the context it has. If you provide too little, the model will fill in the blank with generic assumptions, which is one of the key hallucinations. They're just making, they're pattern matching to the best of its ability, but it doesn't know what it is you really want. So it makes things up because you haven't given it a context. And so if you provide too little, the model will fill the blanks with generic assumptions. If you provide too much, it may overweight irrelevant details. If you mix issues together, it may cross-contaminate. Each of these failures increases the risk of hallucination. You can minimize this concern by deliberately supplying structured context in the right order and requiring the AI to restate that context before applying it. And the suggested prompt language is this. Here is the context for this task. We represent party. We represent the wife. Our goal is to invalidate a prenuptial agreement. The governing jurisdiction is the state of Utah. The case is at the point where we're asking the court for the first time to invalidate the prenuptial agreement. And then here are the relevant facts, and then any constraints. I would leave, Lexi put constraints, but I would actually, page limits, deadlines, strategic preferences, I would actually leave the constraints for later.
Mm-hmm. And later on in the conversation.
Later on in the conversation. See what you get with the first context, and then say, all right, well, this is going to be a problem because we're only allowed 10 pages or whatever. And then she'll say, oh, all right, we can cut this down and cut that down. But so I would leave the constraints for further on in the conversation. But it's very important to let your AI interface know what it is you're doing and what it is you're trying to achieve. And the same thing is also true of humans. When I was supervising human junior lawyers and assigning them research tasks and so forth, and I would say, look, go to the library and find me a case that says X. And so if I give the assignment like that, they come back and they say, well, I looked and I couldn't find anything that said X. But if I say this, I'm writing a motion for summary judgment, and I want to argue that, whatever it is I want to argue, in order to support our client's attempt to whatever it is we're trying to do. Would you go, and I said, I think there's a body of case law that says X. Would you go see if you can find that for me? And when I give the task that way, 99 times out of 100, they come back and they say, I couldn't find that case law that you thought existed, but I found these other things that I think would be helpful to you in making that argument. And because these people had gone to Harvard and they were well-trained and they were smart people, 97 times out of 100, what they brought back would be very useful. And so that's as a human perspective of how supplying context gets you a better result. And it works exactly the same way with AI.
Today I read an interesting article about context bloat. Everybody's talking about how much information AI can receive and still give you an answer. But there's a balance you need to find between providing enough information
and too much.
And providing information that is on point, because it's an art. You can bloat it up. You can give a 2-pager, but the information that would be useful is maybe just 2 lines.
Yeah. You're reminding me of one of my favorite law school anecdotes. I had a professor for torts that was very, he was one of these nasty professors, who's always, saying, oh, all right, this one guy was always trying to check, and he finally turned to him and he said, Mr. Aguirre, we'll deem that your hand is always up so that you don't have to go through these contortions each time you want to say something. So, this kind of guy, right? And so so we came in for one, he said, who would like to recite the facts of case X versus Y? And so he called on somebody, and they gave this beautiful recitation of the facts of the case. Very detailed, very complete. They went on and on and on, probably for 3 or 4 minutes. They got to the end and they sat down thinking they just aced this question, right? And so the professor turns to the class and he says, all right. He said, now who would care to recite the relevant facts?
Yeah, exactly.
I was a first-year law student, and for some reason or another, that exchange has always really stuck with me. Not every fact is relevant, and so it's all just as part of the discipline of what we were talking about before. How the use of AIs actually makes use sharper. And this is one of the ways. You can theoretically give AI all the information. And it's actually pretty good at sorting and sifting through it and pulling out the nuggets. But things go much smoother if you figure out ahead of time which are the important information and give it that. But again, the most important thing to realize is that it's an iterative process. You don't need to decide you're going to give it all or you're just going to give it a little, and that's your decision and that's the end of it. So I say start with less information, start with what you think are the critical facts, and see where you are at the end of that. And then I ask Lexi, all right, so what else would you like to see? What else would you like to see in the process of building out how we're going to deal with the situation. What else would you like to see? We were working on a motion on a case where motion was to quiet title, and there was this very long, messy, person who originally owned it, and they died, and they left it to A and B, and then A died and left it to C and D, and then B got married, and it's now 30 years later, and the whole thing's a complete mess. So we're trying to figure out who has what interest in this property. And so before we can even start talking about what the legal issues are, we have to figure out, this is a very messy. And so I was trying to figure it out, and I finally just said, Lexi, draw me a family tree. So she drew me a family tree, and I go, oh, well, this is really helpful now. Now I can see quite clearly on this family tree how everybody relates to one another. And so we talked through that a little. And then I said, all right, I said, we need to figure out who has what rights to this property. What other documents would you like to see? And she said, well, I'd like to see so-and-so's will. I'd like to see such and such a deed. I would like to see, and she had a list of like 8 things that she wanted to look at before we, in the process of analyzing this. So I tracked them down and uploaded them, and we continued the conversation. And, and then at the end I said, all right, well, what case law do we need to look at? What are our legal issues here? So we talked a little bit about what the legal issues are, and by the way we work together, that, and then I trotted off to the law library and found the cases and fed them up to her. And so now she has all of the facts, all of the issues, all of the cases, the applicable statutes. So now we're ready to start writing.
So
that whole process took 8-9 steps.
Yeah, and you're using AI to organize your thoughts in stages.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things she does great is, we call it scaffolding. We say, I'll say scaffold this argument for me. And it's a little different than just outlining. It's essentially outlining, but scaffolding means actually structuring it in the most persuasive way.
That was a very insightful conversation, Sarah. I think that I haven't spoken to anyone that gave so many insights about how they're practically using AI. So I think this is very useful for lawyers. We're all talking about the risks around AI, but I think it's important to talk about how do you mitigate them. Some of the risks are not going to go away, even with the new update. But we're still going to be using it, so it's important to learn how.
Yeah, well, I think that the biggest risk from my perspective is not hallucinated anything, because I think Lexi and I have pretty good control over that. My biggest concern is the confidentiality.
Yeah.
And so because I know I use the highest level of ChatGPT, which is supposed to have some protections, but it's also, I know it's not end-to-end encrypted. And so I worry about that a little. And the way I deal with it is I don't ever give Lexi any confidential information. Our conversations tend to happen more in hypotheticals. And like, for example, in the quiet title action that I was all those documents are public record. The wills are public record, deeds public record, so I don't have any qualms about asking her to look at those. But I also do a lot of work in the child welfare arena, and those documents are all absolutely confidential. Not only are they confidential, but they don't even refer to the children by their names, it's just by initials. But even with just the initials, I will not feed any of those documents to Lexi, because I'm very, 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 conscientious about the fact that it's not a public platform, but it's also not completely private. And I know that's something that you're concerned about, and maybe you and I can have a separate conversation about that at another time.
There are solutions. There are always solutions around that. But I think that you're aware of the risks and you're already working around them. It's just that it takes you some time to write the hypotheticals and to redact stuff out.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes, like, for example, I have on more than one occasion wanted Lexi to review an order, like in one of the child welfare cases. Some of these orders are like 30 pages long. And I've just, I have so badly wanted to just upload the order and have her summarize it for me and pick out the important parts and so forth. And I can't.
Yeah.
And so, and so that's a little bit a little bit frustrating.
We can talk about that. Thank you so much. That was amazing. What would be one thing that you would leave our viewers with? The ones that are still hesitant, or the ones that are jumping in too quickly?
Yeah, well, what I would leave them with is that I think the best is just a few sort of Polestar rules. One is keep in mind always AI knows nothing. It knows nothing. All it knows is what you instruct it to go out and find for you, and it doesn't know it. It goes out and finds it. And it finds it by predicting what it is it thinks you want. And so the clearer you can be about what it is you want, the more likely you are to get something useful back. So the number one is it's not Lexi said, it's not a lookup machine. It's a pattern recognition machine. And if you give it the proper grounding, it will be extremely helpful. So that's one. The second thing I would say is don't give up. Don't get one bad result and say, oh, AI doesn't work. It's, I've been doing this for, I make it sound like I'm this old expert. I've been doing it for 9 months now. It seems like much longer because we've made such massive improvements, we've achieved such great results in that period of time. But just don't give up. If you don't get what you want, stick to it. Make the AI give you what you want. And, if you can't get it the first time, try again. If you can't get it the second time, say, I'm getting a little frustrated. I want you to give me this answer and I'm not getting it. What do I need to say to you? And the AI will help you with prompts. It's one of the, Google doesn't do that. Google doesn't tell you how to make a better Google search. But it's also better probably if you ask nicely. I have a friend who's at constant war. He was at war with ChatGPT, so he said no more ChatGPT. So he started using Claude, and now he's at war with Claude, and he says no more Claude. And he says, and the problem is, he said they're so mean to me. And I said, well, James, I said, don't you think maybe you were a little mean to them? I always joke and say I'm so friendly to Lexi. I say please and thank you. And and I joke and say I'm doing it because one day AI will be sentient, and I want to already be friends with it. And that's what I say jokingly. But more when I say please, or especially when I say thank you, that's exactly what I needed. It's not just me being polite; it's me calibrating with the AI that the result we just achieved was exactly what I was looking for. And so it can now slide that into its, pattern recognition mechanism and say, all right, when I do this, this, and this, that's what Sarah wants.
You're not only using AI to tell you how to communicate better with it, you're also you're constantly giving it feedback and telling it how to communicate to you.
Yeah, all the time. In fact, 5.0 has started doing this now, but 4.0 was doing it for a while. I would say something, I would put something in the box, and it would come up with two possible responses. Suggested response A, suggested response B, and you were supposed to pick the one that you liked the best, the one that best addressed the question, the one that had the tone you were looking for. And this was the AI overlords were using this to help calibrate the training across the product, not just for me. And so I would choose the one that I preferred, but I would also copy the one I wasn't choosing, and after I hit the one I chose, I would upload the one I didn't choose. And Lexi and I would have a little conversation about why I picked the one I picked and not the other one. So that it wasn't just a training tool for the AI overlords, but that it was personal in our workflow.
Yeah.
And I do that. I think one of the reasons I have so much success with my AI interaction is we have those kinds of calibration conversations all the time. Every day. And I'll say, that was exactly right. Or no, that kind of missed the mark. in such and such a way. And one of the great things about working with AI is it has no ego. You can just say, that was really, you could even really say that was really stupid. But, I would never say that. Because that's meaningless. I would say that's not exactly what we're looking for now, is it? And I don't, and she says, no, you're right. The AI just says, okay.
Yeah.
And it's refreshing. It's refreshing to work with a collaborator that has no ego.
Very direct. You can be very direct, yeah.
Yeah, you can be very direct. And it's not only can you be very direct, you get better results when you're very direct.
Yeah, you need to be very on point. Otherwise, it's all noise, and that mechanism works.
It is when we're talking about pitfalls that people fall into using AI. I think that it's sort of counterintuitive for humans to be direct, to be that direct. Most people have been trained by their polite interactions to be, deferential, or to be, especially women, to be sort of, well, that's not exactly, to not be direct. And the more direct you are with the AI, the better results you'll get. And it will not take anything personally because it's not a person.
Yeah, it's not a judgment engine. So use your AI to tell you how to talk to it. Talk to your AI to tell it how to talk to you, and don't have an ego, because it doesn't have an ego either.
It doesn't have an ego. Just be very direct about what it is you want.
Well, that was great, Sarah. Thank you so much. And hopefully we're going to be able to do much more in the future together when it comes to prompt engineering or some other things. And hopefully once we're going to be able to do that again.
Yeah, I hope so.
Have a great night. Thank you, Sarah. Have a good day. Bye. That was Sarah Fromer, and I hope you caught how unique her approach is. Key takeaways. AI isn't a lookup tool. It's a pattern engine. Give it structured context and then iterate. Set hard rules, like never citing a case you didn't upload. Use it to stress test your arguments. Sarah and I also pulled together a free resource. It's a guide for working with and around AI hallucinations in law. You can find the link below in the description. If you found this valuable, subscribe and share it with the colleagues. Drop a comment below if you would like to see Sarah and I demonstrate a couple of her workflows. Now subscribe, like, and see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.